What's that? Yeah. Yeah. But we are happy to see everyone this morning. Glad to see Janet Ezekiel, Adriana's mother. Glad to see Lee back and everyone else who's present this morning. Brother Farron is having a bout with Meniere's, Sandra just told me, and so that accounts for his absence. Our readings have taken us from Joshua on into Judges this time, so we'll start there, then go right on into Malachi in just a moment. In the book of Joshua, as we end, actually where we would have been Thursday, Friday, and Saturday would be Numbers 76 through, now I don't mean the book of Numbers, but on our chart, 76, 77, 78, then today is 79, so that's Joshua 22 through 24, and then Judges, the first 7 chapters. Briefly, Joshua is about what? That's right, conquering and the division of the land. And then we have really the first 12 chapters dealing with the conquest and then how they were divided among their what? Their tribes. And when we come down to, we pointed out Wednesday night, in Joshua, the 21st chapter, is the last little paragraph, 43 through 45. You might want to highlight those verses because it shows that everything God had promised relative to the land promise, or the land, that they would receive what? It fulfilled. There was not a single solitary thing that God had promised that failed. There failed not aught of any good thing. All right, in 22, 23, and 24, we have the last part of Joshua. In chapter 22, what happens? Anybody? Good. Reuben, Gad, the half-tribe of Manasseh go back to their, what's sometimes called the Transjordanic tribes or tribal areas. And then in 23 and 24, we have actually 2 addresses of Joshua, farewell addresses, the marginal reading of my Bible, or the topical reading says. In chapter 23, he calls all Israel, the elders, and so on. This is in 23, verse 2, and says, you've seen what God has done. Verse 6, be very courageous to keep and to do all this. And then in chapter 24, he gathers, in verse 1, he gathers all the tribes of Israel to Shechem. Real briefly, Shechem is significant to the Bible story all the way back to Genesis 12 because it was at Shechem that God originally made, what, Brother Gene? That's right, the promises, the land promise in particular, chapter 12 of Genesis, verse 7. And to me, that's like if somebody, years, our Constitution was ratified where in our country? Remember? And I know you don't remember, but you weren't there. But where? Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And it's like if somebody came back to Philadelphia and here's the Constitution, and we need to come back to this. It's the very place and the very thing that was ratified, and go from there. So here's Shechem, the original place where the land was promised Abraham, Genesis 12:7. And Joshua has gathered everybody, and I think you probably remember, I've made this point several times in various lessons. All of the verbs that Joshua uses in this speech, what God has done. Look at verse 3. I took, I led, I multiplied. Verse 4, I gave. Verse 5, I sent Moses, plagued Egypt. Verse 6, I brought your fathers. Verse 7, put darkness, brought the sea, covered them. Verse 8, brought you into the land, gave you your land. I mean, you just go through that. And so then he actually summarizes the speech. This is all God has done for you. Therefore, what you need to do is serve him in sincerity and in truth. Put away the gods that your fathers served on the other side of the river, and the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. Because as for me and my house, what? We will serve the Lord. And they agree. True or false? They'd say, oh, yes. And it's almost like Joshua comes, well, it's not almost, he does. Joshua says, you really aren't. This is in the verse 16 of 24. The people said, far be it that we should forsake the Lord. Verse 19, Joshua said, you cannot serve God. He's a holy God. If you forsake him, serve foreign gods. They're still at the very end of the life of Joshua. He's saying what? Don't do what? Don't get into idolatry. He knew it was a problem. Guess what? It was a problem throughout their whole history. And the captivity that we had studied, they're going into Babylon, all of that was a result really of the denial of God, his place, and the worshiping idols. It's always been pointed out, guys, that when you think about idolatry, idolatry is basically making God in my image. Whereas God made us in his image, we make a God in our image, what we like, what we want. And then to serve that God, we basically do whatever we want to do and call that the service of the God. And if the God, whether it be Bacchus, provides us good grapes and we have wine and we have all kinds of debauchery and drunkenness, then that we worship our God when we do that. And Aphrodite with sexual relations and all that. It's just a matter that I made this God in the image I want him to be. And that's kind of easy, isn't it? When you make a God in your own image, and then when you worship him, you're really doing what you want to do instead of what God wants to do. So this was a problem then. Joshua dies. It's interesting. He dies at the age of 100 and what? 10. And it's interesting also in verse 32, the bones of Joseph, which the children of Israel brought up out of Egypt. Remember all the way to Genesis 50. He made the sons swear that when he said, our God will one day visit us. As they went out on the day of the Passover. And so here they bring Joseph's bones and they bury him where? Verse 32. In Shechem, same place. And so you have the wonderful work of Joshua. It's been said that Joshua is a book of victory, followed by Judges, a book of defeat for the Lord's part. And that summarizes it pretty well. And so Joshua, we've had a couple things briefly. We've had a centralized leadership in Israel with Moses and then Joshua. Well, you know where I'm going with this. What happens during the days of the Judges? Exactly. And that phrase that Brother Gene quoted is mentioned twice in the book. And it's just like they're just going, helter-skelter. The five cycles of the Judges, the people would do exactly what Joshua warned them against. They would begin to serve apostasy. They would serve other gods. Then God would send a what? An oppressor. Now here's a neat idea about the providence of God. He would send an oppressor, but the oppressors were actually nations that they had failed to do what? Drive out. And so it's almost, and that's stated in those first few chapters of Judges, that God used the very thing that they did not do to come back in chastisement. So you've got the serving of idols, then God would send an oppressor, a nation round about, and then they would cry out for help. God would send a deliverer, and then the fifth thing, there would be a period of peace, usually 20, 40 years, depending. And that's what we see. So in Judges, the first three chapters, we have the introduction and the deteriorated conditions. He gives some of the places here, the tribal divisions. And it's interesting that on all through one, look at, I'm just picking and choosing. 121, the children of Benjamin did not do what? Drive out the Jebusites. Look at 27, Manasseh did not what? Drive out the inhabitants of Bethshean. Verse 29, Ephraim drove not out the Canaanites. 30, Who? Zebulun, 31. Asher, 33. Naphtali, 34. The Amorites. And after each one, they did not drive those people completely out, exterminate them, as Deuteronomy 7 had said for them to do. And as a result, it came back to bite them. And it had ended up, guess what? The very thing that God through Moses said in Deuteronomy 7, don't let your daughters marry their sons, don't let your sons marry their daughters. What happened? It did, and as a result of that, there was just a spiraling decline among the morality and the worship of these people, and it ended up in, the pagan practices infiltrated. And so that's what we have here in these passages. Yes, sir.
Like you said, when they made their idols the way they wanted
Yes.
to do what they wanted, they were in charge.
Yes.
When God was in charge of what He wanted, not
Yes.
what they wanted.
Yes, that's exactly right. When I was younger, I really thought, what is the business about this idolatry? How in the world could somebody be so foolish to make something out of wood or metal and then bow down to it? Well, that's the topical, that's the superficial look at it. The idols simply represented what you wanted to do. And it was all sensually, materialistic, physically based. And so that tells us another thing. When I was told by a couple of fellows who were sons of a fellow who was faithful, he said, well, there's no difference in morality when people don't honor God. I said, you got to be kidding. I said, you have no clue about what's happened in either sacred or profane history. Everywhere there have been cultures where God has been pushed out, what happens? The morality it goes off the deep end. You're going to say something like it plummets. And the passage, we see that in secular history. In divine history, we see it in Romans 1. Those that had a knowledge of God refused to have God in their knowledge, and so all kinds of debased debauchery that they engaged in, from lesbianism, homosexuality, having no natural affection, covenant breakers, all those things, they just went off the deep end. And that, because you don't have a respect for God and an accountability to God, it's basically whatever I want to do that I can get away with. And that's what we have to a large degree in the book of Judges. Real quickly, you'll notice one thing that most of us in our room here can quote this, or we've heard it a lot. And I'm trying to find it. Yes, thank you. Verse 10. Yes, thank you, Gene. Also, that generation were gathered unto their fathers. This speaking of Joshua back in verse 8. And there arose another generation after them that knew not the Lord, nor the work which He had wrought for Israel. President Reagan said in a speech years ago that we are one generation. What was it? We're one generation removed from democracy. In other words, it doesn't take but one generation and you can forget everything that's gone on in the past and lose the kind of republic government that we have. Likewise, spiritually. In fact, it doesn't even take one generation sometimes. It can be less than that. We see incremental changes that are made in various churches, and a church won't even come close to a 42nd cousin removed from what it had been just a few years before. Wrong people in leadership, wrong kind of teaching. But anyway, what happened here is there arose this generation that knew not God, and then we have in chapter 2 kind of a generalized idea of these cycles. In chapter 3, real quick, I know our time is getting away. Look at 3 verse 1. These are the nations which the Lord left to prove Israel by them, even as many of Israel as had not known all the wars of Canaan. Only that the generation of children might know to teach them warredly. In other words, God used what they did wrong as a what, Landon?
Is a reminder of, you didn't follow what I said.
Yeah.
So, I can get you.
Exactly. And here's another little tidbit in our Bible study. Sometimes things that God is said to have done are actually those things that he allowed. God did, if you look at verse 1, these are the nations which the Lord left. Did the Lord actually leave them of his own? No, actually, who was responsible? Israel was responsible. And so some things that God can use and not necessarily intervene in, he said to accomplish. And that's an idea there. All right, in 3, we went down through chapter 5. In chapter 3, Israel is delivered from Cushan, Rishathaim, and then we have the beginning of the Judges. Othniel. Who's next? Ehud. And then in chapter 3, verse 31, Shamgar smote, and you see they're smiting various of the nations around about them. Who in chapter 4 do we have? Deborah. And then in chapter 5 we have the Song of Deborah. All right, the Song of Deborah. Now let's stop there. 6 and 7 we'll pick up in Wednesday night. But here we have the beginning of the Judges, and that will continue on really through chapter 16 with the end of with Samuel, with Samson, and then in 17 through 21 we have the some of their failures and the Benjamites almost getting wiped out, and then we'll end up the Judges. I know Sandra put all this together. You have the Judges really beginning in the book of Judges, chapter 3 or 4, and they go all the way past Judges, past the next book, which is Ruth, all the way into where, Sandra? 1 Samuel what? I know you know, where they said, give us a king. Okay, who 1 Samuel chapter 8. Yeah, and so all the way from Judges, Ruth, and the first 7 chapters of 1 Samuel, we have the Judges, ending with the last 2 in 1 Samuel, which were Eli and Samuel. Okay, all right, enough on that, but I hope you're enjoying our reading. Let's go to Malachi, and let's see how far we can get. I keep thinking the next class we're finishing, and then I put together additional notes and all right, Malachi. Let me get my wheels turning right. We got Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther as our history books, and then Haggai and Zechariah, who wrote about the time when what was being constructed. Haggai and Zechariah, the temple, and then now Malachi is really I think it's at the end of Nehemiah, which would put it 4:30 or so, anywhere from 4:45 probably on possibly down to 4:25. All right, and so in Malachi, let me go back again one more time. In Nehemiah, the 10th chapter, when they have this revival and they say, okay, some things that we've gotten wrong that we are really committed to getting right. The 3 big things were we've blown it on our, what Lee and I are? Yeah, our marriages. We've blown it on our, not that we, that didn't sound right, did it, Landon? No, just marriages. We've blown that. A second thing, we haven't been keeping the what day? The Sabbath day. And the third thing is we've not brought in tithes and offerings. The sacrifice is right. And it's almost like Malachi is taking all this and saying, you're still doing it wrong. And so in chapter 1, they've got everything going wrong. The condemnation of the people, the priest's faithlessness here, and then the condemnation of the mixed marriages and divorces. And then in 2:7, as we mentioned Wednesday night, most conservative scholars look at 2:17 as the beginning of the end, and it goes on through I didn't have this Wednesday night, but much of the 3rd and 4th chapters of Malachi look forward to the Messianic kingdom. We're going to have a little bit. They'll talk about, God says, you robbed me. Wherein have we robbed you? Well, in the tithes and offerings. Well, how have we done that? And then he goes up. So that was present tense there. That was the present. And oh, it's so vain to serve the Lord. What a weariness it is. He comes back to that in the end of 3. But marked through chapter 3 as well as 4, it looks like he's talking about the Messianic age for the most part. And he goes from there. In 3, the future coming will involve a judgment. It's not final, but likely the destruction of Jerusalem that we talked about Wednesday night, and their end as a national people. And also, as the gospel would be ushered in the Lord's age or the Messianic age, there's a division that will be. I was telling Leah on the way over, I said, you know, when you think about this, there's still a physical a physical family nation, so to speak. The family of Jacob, and they became a nation, and God's dealt with them as a nation. And in that physical nation, you have a few who are trying to do right, but you have the majority who don't care. Well, he pictures really in chapter 3 and 4, he pictures this little group of people who want to do right and who don't say some of the things that the others are saying and challenging God's justice, as 2:17 shows. They're not doing that. And he promises them a blessing and the fact that these other people are going to be overturned. Likely he's talking about they'll be overturned in the destruction of Jerusalem. The physical nation itself will come to an end. That's kind of an oversimplification maybe, but I think that's possibly it. We ended up at 3 verse 6, didn't we, Richard? 3:6. And if you'll notice here, in verse 1, by the way, everybody, behold, I send my messenger, and he shall prepare the way before me. We talked about that at length Wednesday night. Who is it? John the Baptist. We have 2 people, I think, identified in verse 1. The second, and the Lord whom ye seek will suddenly come to his temple, and the messenger of the covenant, all in one here, whom ye desire, behold, he comes. Who's that? That's Jesus Christ. So you have John as well as Jesus referred to, I take it, in one verse here. But who can abide the day of his coming? Who shall stand when he appears? He's like a refiner's fire, a fuller's soap. I think this idea is going to come back in chapter 4 with the idea that there's going to be a separation made between the righteous and the wicked, or between those who want to serve God and the wicked. And those who serve God in this day will notice in verse 4, this element of the gospel will refine. In verse 4, then shall the offering of Judah and Jerusalem be pleasant unto the Lord, as in the days of old, that is, in days where righteous people serve God, and as in ancient years, and I will come near to you to judgment. On the other hand, there will be a separation. The sorcerers, adulterers, false swearers, those who oppress the hireling in his wages, the widow and the fatherless, and that turn aside the sojourner from his right, those who don't fear me, I'll come in judgment against them. And then verse 6, for I, Jehovah, change not, therefore ye, O sons of Jacob, are not consumed. This is where we ended Wednesday night. And we made the point here that at least, verse 6 looks in at least 2 different directions. God's purpose of the chastisement was to discipline, to refine and purify his people. That's always been it in the Old Testament. And he continues this even in the New Testament. For I, Jehovah, change not. Y'all have heard me quote James 1:2-4 enough. You can probably say it in your sleep. Count it all joy, my brethren, when you fall into manifold trials. You're not saying it in your sleep. That the proving of your faith works patience, and let patience have its perfect work, that you may be what? Perfect and entire, lacking in nothing. So the chastisements of the Lord can work that. And then remember, if he gave them what they deserved and wiped them out as a nation, then the seed promise that he had promised in the long ago would not be fulfilled. So the seed promise had to be fulfilled, and though he chastened them, he did not exterminate them, but he preserved Judah through whom Jesus would eventually come. And that, I think, is what the understanding of the last part of the verse. For I, the Lord, change not. Therefore ye, O sons of Jacob, you're not consumed. I didn't bring you to an end. No, you're still here. And I'm not changed. My promises will be fulfilled just as I said. All right, comment, questions? Anything? All right, let's move on then. In 3 verses 7 through 9, the people's fickleness, the Lord's curse, and yet there's a reward of respect for those who do bring in. God will reward them. Let's read that, 7 through 9. Brother Charlie, if you would, 7 through 9.
Days of our fathers, ye have turned aside from my statutes and have not kept them. Return to me, and I will return to you, says the Lord of hosts. And you say, how shall we return? Will a man rob God? Yet you are robbing me. But you say, how have we robbed you? In tithes and offerings. You are cursed with a curse, for you are robbing me, the whole nation.
All right, and here we come back to the charge that God gives them, that this kind of a cycle that only Malachi really uses. There are a few other times in the Bible where you see it sporadically used, but for the most part, God makes an indictment against them. Then he anticipates their answer. Then third, he comes back and he answers what he anticipates they will say. And so here, that's the same thing here. You return to me and I will return to you. But they say, how? How's that? Did we ever leave you, God? And he says specifically, well, will a man rob God? Here's a way that you've not returned to me. You've said back in Nehemiah, Nehemiah wasn't broken down into the chapters, but he could have said, don't you remember what you covenanted to do for me back in the days of when Nehemiah was with you and all that you after the big revival there in chapter 8 and the confession of sins in 9 and chapter 10 when you renewed your covenant? Don't you remember any of that? About the tithing and the firewood that you were going to bring in on a voluntary basis? Don't you remember anything? Yet you robbed me. Well, they say, well, how's that? Wherein have we robbed thee? Well, here's a quick answer. In tithes and offerings. You're cursed. You robbed me, even the whole nation. Real quick, and then we'll look at 10 through 12 where he gives the answer. If you change, things will be different for you. We're aware of some places, in fact, been a member of church where the church was actually broken into and robbed. And I've heard members of the church say, you just kind of wonder if God's got an especially hot place in hell for people who would steal and break in church buildings. That just seems like that's the lowest as low you can go. Well, that's pretty low, all right. But what about members of the church who are saying to God, here he is, I'm giving as I'm been prospered, but really not? Is there any difference in it? There's no difference in principle. We're saying, as Paul said in 1 Corinthians 16, we are to lay by him in store or in a storage as God hath prospered him, that there be no collections when I come. And so, doing some reading on this, the Jews were, insofar as the firstling of the flock, the grain offerings, as well as material things of any kind of a money, they were to bring how much? The tithe, which is a tenth. But it has been estimated by a number of different people in all kinds of religious backgrounds that if you added up the tenth of everything that they were supposed to bring in, it would possibly be as much as 30 to 40%. But they were an agrarian society. They had crops and herds, flocks, and so what they had available was what they brought. But it does make us think about this, and that is that if we live under a superior covenant that has superior privileges, it looks like to me, based on what we have coming in, we ought to start at 10%. not be that's where we ought to start and go up from there. If we have all the blessings that we believe that we have and that we really know that we have, that we need to do that. And so as a friend of ours, he's dead now, Billy Lovell said, he said, Brother Philip, he said, years ago I thought to myself, I can never outgive God. Never outgive God. And that's so true. You look like you're going to say something, Brother Gene. All right. All right, let's move on. Well, here's the answer, 10 through 12, Lee, if you would.
Bring all the tithes into the storehouse, that there may be food in my house, and try me now, says the Lord of hosts, and I will not open for you the windows of heaven and pour out for you such a blessing that there will not be room enough to receive it. And I will rebuke the devourer for your sake, so that he will not destroy the fruit of your ground. Nor shall the vine fail bear fruit for you in the field, says the Lord of hosts. And all the nations will call you blessed, for you will be a delightful land, says the Lord of hosts.
That's it, that down through 12. Okay, so 7 through 9 is the indictment, and then here's the remedy. In 10 through 12, he says, you bring the whole tithe into the storehouse. You remember the storehouse is mentioned over there in Nehemiah. The storage areas around the temple. In fact, who is that fella who, Elisha was the priest, and who did he allow, an enemy of God, to have an apartment there where the store? Tobiah, yeah. Let him have basically a room right there. All of that illegal. They shouldn't have done that. And he says, you bring this and put it in the storehouse that there may be food in my house. Well, that would be food for those for whom it was intended, which would be the priest as well as the, I got that backwards. It should be, the tithe would be for the Levites, and then the tithe of the tithe for the priest. Yeah, so the Levites and the priests, those for whom it was given. And just test me, prove me, middle of verse 10. Prove me, test me, saith the Lord, if I will not open you the windows of heaven and pour you out a blessing, that there shall not be room enough to receive it. You still are holding back on me. And if you do this, I will remove. In fact, he says in verse 11, I will rebuke or remove the devourer. I think the NIV has pests on there. Most translations have devourer. Whatever it was that God was using or allowing to be used to wipe out or to diminish the crops, he said, I'll take care of that. And I'll open you the windows of heaven and pour you out a blessing where there's not room enough to receive it. You'll have more than enough. I'll rebuke the devourer. Neither shall your vine cast. What does it mean to cast its fruit? C-A-S-T. Yes, exactly right. They'll just. It's when fruit falls off prematurely, and it has actually the same idea with a lady who is expecting a baby who miscarries. It's casting its young. It's unable to bring the fruit to delivery, and so neither shall your vine cast its fruit. And as a result of that, if you did that, there would be people all around you who would say, well, these people are what? Verse 12. Yeah, they're a delight. They're happy or they're blessed. We see how God has blessed them. That was a part of the law, in fact. All right, comment or question on any of this? Anybody? Lindsay, you're pretty quiet. Okay, Cooper, you got anything? All right, well, let's move on then. In verses 13 through 4 verse 3, there is a new defense of God's justice. Look back in 2:17. 2:17. You have wearied me with your words. How? What did they say? What's that, David? Yeah, how? 17. What were they saying that was wearisome to God? Yes, that's it. And he delights in them. And then they accuse God of not being a God of what? The end of the verse there. A God of justice. So, in other words, they say, God, you're just unjust. And it's interesting, we're not in the place of God, but I felt the same way God says, he says through here. You get really tired, really weary of hearing people say, well, God, if he's such a good God, why do bad things happen to good people? And all of these kinds of ideas which indicate that people think if they serve God, everything good is going to happen to them right now. And the truth of the matter is, God does not settle his accounts in this life, always. There are blessings that we have, and for Christians, spiritual blessings. And I'll have to say there are some physical blessings we have, but the bulk of our blessings are not intended now. They're intended in the life to come. And they thought that if they didn't just immediately, throw God a bone and then they'd have all these riches, and then God's not being just. And so here he says, he comes back to that in 3:13. Let's read 3:13 through that paragraph, 3:13 through 15. Lindsay, if you would.
Your words have been hard against me, says the Lord. But you say, how come we should against you? You have said, is it vain to serve God? What is the profit of our keeping his charge, or of walking as in mourning before the Lord of hosts? And now we call the arrogant blessed. Evildoers not only prosper, but they...
Yes, I want us to keep your finger there and turn back to Psalm 73. Psalm 73 is a wonderful answer to this whole idea. We can go to other passages all through the Bible to show that we ought not to serve God thinking, it's like I see over on Lorna Road. You got a bunch of Mexicans there that are waiting to be picked up to do some physical manual labor, and then they expect money that day. It's not that. That's not how God rewards us. But in the 73rd Psalm that Asaph writes, you may have a topical reading, the end of the wicked contrasted with that of the righteous, or something like that. Do you see that? And it's interesting, we're not going to read the whole thing, but look at 3. For I was envious at the arrogant when I saw the prosperity of the wicked. No pangs in their death. Verse 5, there's no trouble. Verse 6, pride is a chain about their, they just wear their pride around their neck. Violence covers them. They scoff, verse 8. They speak loftily or proudly, verse 8. Their mouths are against the heavens, verse 9. And in 13, surely in vain have I cleansed my heart. I've just served the Lord in vain, it seems. But, drop down to verse 17. Here is your key. I thought all that until what? Yes. And considered their end, their latter end. Things that appear to be rosy now is not always how things are. And so he goes ahead and answers that. Verse 21, my soul was grieved and I was pricked in my heart. So brutish or senseless was I and ignorant. I was as a beast before them, and so on. And so he understands that what appears to be now is not always how things really are insofar as the relation to God. That's a great psalm that hits right at the heart of this problem that we see in Malachi. You think they sang that song much? The Psalms were songs. And I was thinking really early this morning, I was thinking, I wonder if they ever sang that psalm. If they did, they wouldn't be making charges against God like they made them. And we've got to be careful that when we sing psalms or songs, that, we get the intent and we don't come back and make statements that as if we never even heard the song. Yes, sir.
This is an attitude that we see among Christians today.
Yes, yes.
I'm sure thinking of one specific Christian right now that has this attitude of, why
Yes, yeah,
But it's there if we study and
yes.
and we read, and I don't understand that mentality of thinking.
Yeah.
We as Christians need to be careful of that.
Exactly. What do you think, Brandon? In a condition like that, here's some prime of life, and they got a really terrible disease that doesn't look good for them. Well, where's God when I need Him? Well, God's always there. What happens if somebody's killed in a traffic accident? It's not their fault. Where's God when I need them? Well, things happen. Things happen. Sometimes we endure the consequences of other people's sins. Sometimes we endure the consequences, not necessarily the guilt, but the consequences of our own sins, though we might repent of them and be forgiven of them. We deal with that out at Donaldson all the time. We baptize some people. They don't have the guilt of their sins, but they're still living out the consequences of their sins. So pain and suffering happen for a multitude of reasons, or causes, I should say. And how we deal with that, like we quoted a while ago in James 1, if we use difficulties, outward trials, to strengthen us, then that's how God wants it to be. He wants us to use whatever comes in life to make us stronger. Paul prayed the Lord 3 times that the what? Thorn in his flesh be removed. But God said, my what is sufficient for you? My grace is sufficient for you. And so Paul then resigned himself that, if that's the way it is, then I glory in this. For, when I'm weak, then I'm strong. And so all these difficulties that come can help us if we look at the right play. But that's not how they looked at it. And there's a weakness on their part. Yes, sir.
I got
Lynn?
one more thought, and I'll be quiet.
That's all right.
What we see here, in verse 17, they're asking, where's the God of justice?
Yes.
Would we talk to our parents that way,
Yeah. Yeah.
but yet they're talking to God?
Yes. Yeah.
That's just the attitude that is portrayed here. They have forgotten who they are,
Yes.
and just another thing that we need to be careful of.
They had really not changed. I mean, if they changed, it had been temporarily. And so he indicts them with, they're bringing their lame. They're not bringing their best. Oh, that reminds me, that I had jotted down a passage. Look real quickly. Hold your finger there. Deuteronomy 28, verse 47. Whoever has that first, read it. Deuteronomy 28, 47.
Because you did not serve the Lord your God with joyfulness and gladness of heart, because of the abundance of all things.
In the next verse.
Therefore you shall serve your enemies, whom the Lord will send against you in hunger and thirst, in nakedness and lacking everything. And he will put a yoke of iron on your neck until he has destroyed you.
Yes, not only idolatry, but here he says if you serve the Lord without being what? Glad, joyful. Yeah. If you don't, Lee and I were talking about kind of like this on the way over, that when people go away from the fact of emphasizing and considering the things that they do have, the blessings they do, and being thankful, because worship to a large degree is really based on the fact of thankfulness. Colossians 3, 16, on singing. Let the word of Christ dwell in you richly in all wisdom, teaching and admonishing one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing with grace. What's yours say? Faithfulness. Thankfulness. Singing with grace in your hearts to the Lord. Translated, thankfulness. Grace, favor, that God has been so good. So I want to tell him how much I appreciate it. That's really the basis of worship. And if we don't consider that, and we're back thinking, how weary do I have to come to serve? And we can't get back into the line of, well, let's look at all the good things we have, and the very fact that we got a building to meet in. and that we have God that we can call Father, and we have people who we can call brethren. And they're interested in me, and I'm interested in them. And this is kind of like an extended family. And when the problem occurs, they'll come to my aid. And if they have a problem, I'll be there. And all of these things that are designed for our good, and we don't consider that, then it's easy to get to exactly where they were, and that is what it is to serve the Lord. Back in what a weariness it is. And it's vain to say, I don't get anything out of it. Have you ever heard people say that? I just don't get anything out of church. It reminds me of what Dad said, Brother Lewis said one time. Brother Lewis, I didn't get anything out of that. And he said, you didn't bring anything to put it in. That's the way it is. We don't think about what we do have, and which gives us the impetus to go ahead and serve the Lord with joy that he talked about there in Deuteronomy 28. Okay, comment, question? Yes, sir, Brother Gene. Right.
And you think about Job, God never said, Job, it's the devil that's tempting you, and I'm on your side.
Yes.
I know that you're going to do what you're supposed to do.
Yes.
And the devil is wrong, whatever goes on behind the scenes, so to speak.
Right.
We don't know who God allows to be tempted and tested.
And how even.
We do
Yeah.
know that he is not the source. He said, God tempted
No man. Exactly.
You're not tempted above that you're able to stand.
Right.
So you need to figure something bad has happened to you. God is on your side.
Yes.
And who are we to say that God is my helper? Who can harm me?
Yes. Hebrews 13. That's a good point. Real good.
I can't remember the lady's name. She lived up the street from us, and we lived on Avenue C in India. And she was, I thought she was old as the hills when I was 25.
Yeah.
She
She's probably 35.
She might have been all of 50, I guess.
Yeah.
But she had a handicapped daughter.
Yeah.
The lady was always just so nice and so sweet and pleasant.
Yeah.
She said she had a sorry husband that didn't support her. She had this sick daughter that was, I would say she would have been 30 years old, handicapped, like an infant.
Mhm.
And she told Janet one time that Janet said, how are you so nice when you know
Yeah.
so much trouble? She said, honey, the Lord picks the strongest back to carry the heaviest load.
Yeah. 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 I've thought about it in similar ways that he doesn't allow anything to come our way that we personally can't handle. And yet, when we see difficulties that individuals have, whether it be physical, mental, emotional, you just know coming into it what you just said, that if they have it, they're able to bear it, or else God would be unfaithful to his word. That's a great. Lindsay, anything? Anyone? Yes. Yeah. 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 Let this cup pass from me. Yeah, everything that was in him from a human point of view was crying out, I really don't want to go through with this. But then, there's a submission. Yes. Yeah. What's that, sweetie? Yeah, Lee just said that's heaven. And that's exactly right. That's heaven. Yes, goes back to that passage there. Well, y'all just won't let me keep going, will you? It's all y'all's fault. Really enjoyed being with you. Our time has passed, and we'll have to stop there. I couldn't help but think of something else. I have to wait, though. There's so many applications I read Jack P. Lewis. He has a little booklet on Malachi, on all the minor prophets. He was evidently a wonderful student of the Bible. I think he was like a nephew or something of Brother John T. Lewis. But anyway, he taught up at Freed Hardeman. And anyway, he made the point that as long as people are more interested in their own houses and having the finest for their own houses, and they don't care, this is good enough for the Lord, Malachi is applicable. Back in chapter 1. I couldn't help but think how true that is. Okay, thank you.